The massacre at My Lai was first recorded as a successful operation. Hundreds of civilians lay dead. The official report listed enemy killed in action. It was reviewed, approved, and transmitted up the chain of command. Promotions followed. No national inquiry began. For more than a year, that account stood. What happened at My Lai did not nearly disappear because there were no witnesses. It nearly disappeared because it was documented as something else. Who reviewed those reports? Who chose not to challenge them? How many opportunities were there to interrupt the record before it hardened into fact? And when the massacre finally became public, why did accountability narrow instead of widen? The version that entered the official archive began that morning, and it did not look like a massacre. Task Force Barker was an ad hoc unit drawn from the 11th Light Infantry Brigade, numbering fewer than 500 soldiers in total. On the morning of March 16, 1968, Charlie Company, 1st Battalion, 20th Infantry Regiment, roughly 100 men, air assaulted into a hamlet designated My Lai 4. One of its platoons, led by Lieutenant William Calley, numbered about 30. The area had been framed as hostile. Some soldiers later recalled being told that anyone present would be Viet Cong or Viet Cong sympathizers. The distinction between combatant and civilian blurred before the helicopters even landed. When they touched down, they encountered civilians rather than armed resistance. Yet over the next several hours, between 347 and 504 unarmed Vietnamese civilians were killed in My Lai, with roughly 90 more killed in nearby My Quy. There was no sustained or organized enemy fire, but by midday, the hamlets were devastated. The violence on the ground was so severe that Warrant Officer Hugh Thompson, who was flying reconnaissance overhead, landed his helicopter between the soldiers and fleeing villagers and instructed his crew to fire on the U.S. troops if the shooting continued. Several civilians were evacuated under his protection. Thompson reported what he had witnessed through his chain of command later that day, but the version that moved upward did not reflect what he described. Field reports recorded high enemy body counts and minimal weapons recovered. On paper, it was a successful operation, and from that moment forward, two versions of the day existed: the reality of what happened in the village and what was recorded in the official report. As the written version moved up the chain of command, it gained authority, and with each approval, it became harder to contest. Reversing it would now require disruption at a higher level, and there was no guarantee that disruption would come. To understand why the initial reports took the shape they did, it is necessary to look at the unit itself. Most of the enlisted men had received only roughly 16 weeks of training before being sent to Vietnam. By the time of the operation, many had been in country less than 4 months, and the brigade itself was still relatively new to the theater. Junior officers were frequently recent officer candidate school graduates. Lieutenant William Calley commanded 1st Platoon under the authority of Captain Ernest Medina, the commander of Charlie Company. Calley was inexperienced and widely described as struggling in leadership, while Medina, as his direct commanding officer, was responsible for setting operational expectations and maintaining discipline. Testimony later suggested tension between them, with Medina reportedly critical of Calley's performance before March 16th. The company had recently taken casualties from mines and booby traps, a form of warfare that killed without visible enemies and offered no clear target for retaliation. In that environment, suspicion replaced certainty. Villages could be hostile, civilians could be enemy supporters, but nothing about the unit's experience justifies what happened. When the shooting stopped, the focus shifted from the village to the report. Officers now had to decide how the day would be recorded and under whose authority. After-action reports moved upward describing a successful engagement. Enemy killed in action, civilian casualties minimal. A brigade-level assessment described roughly 20 civilians caught in crossfire. There was no formal acknowledgement of a massacre, and an early internal inquiry asked narrow questions that produced reassuring answers. There was no single meeting in which a cover-up was designed. Instead, The account moved forward through ordinary channels. Each officer who reviewed the report affirmed what had already been written, and what began as battlefield reporting gradually became an institutional position. Once that position entered the official record, it grew increasingly resistant to change. Just over 1 year later, on March 25, 1969, a specialist named Tom Glenn, serving with the American Division, sent a letter to senior military leaders. Drawing on his own field observations and reports circulating within the division, he alleged patterns of brutality against Vietnamese civilians. 4 days later, on March 29, 1969, Ronald Ridenhour, a former Army door gunner who had not been present at My Lai but had heard detailed accounts from soldiers who were, mailed letters to members of Congress, the Pentagon, and the White House urging investigation. Troubled by what he learned, he gathered testimonies and pressed the issue outside the immediate chain of command. While Ridenhour's letters moved toward Washington, Glenn's warning remained inside the division. The Glenn letter moved through the American Division's chain of command and was handled internally rather than immediately being escalated. Responsibility for reviewing the allegations fell to Major Colin Powell, then serving as Assistant Chief of Staff for operations within the division. In April 1969, Powell issued his response. His report concluded that relations between American Division soldiers and Vietnamese civilians were excellent and found no evidence of systematic misconduct. Later critics would describe the report as whitewashing, but at the time, it preserved stability. Powell's findings were accepted within the division. No broader investigation was ordered, no higher authority intervened. But Ridenhour's letters did not depend on divisional review. They moved beyond it. By late summer 1969, the Army's Criminal Investigation Division had opened a formal inquiry, and on September 5, 1969, they filed charges against Lieutenant William Calley for the premeditated murder of Vietnamese civilians at My Lai. Additional investigations would later examine other officers and enlisted men connected to the operation. More than a year had passed since the massacre, and by that point, many soldiers involved had left active duty. Under the Supreme Court's ruling in Toth versus Quarles, former service members could not be court-martialed once discharged, limiting who could be prosecuted. The delay had already narrowed the scope of accountability before the first court-martial convened. But once the story reached the public, the investigation moved beyond the Army's control. Public awareness began in November 1969, when investigative journalist Seymour Hersh reported that Lieutenant William Calley had been charged in connection with civilian deaths. His story began circulating on November 12th and 13th through the Dispatch News Service. Major national newspapers soon followed, and the name My Lai entered the national conversation. It was no longer described as a combat action, but instead as a massacre. The legal process was still in its early stages, but the internal version of events was no longer confined to military channels. Just over a week later, on November 20th, 1969, Life magazine published photographs taken at My Lai by Army photographer Ronald Ridenhour. Ridenhour had carried 2 cameras on the day of the massacre. The official Army issue camera yielded only limited black and white images. However, his personal camera captured color photographs of civilians moments before they were killed. When those photographs appeared in Life magazine, the story could no longer be described as an allegation. The images showed women, children, and elderly villagers gathered, terrified, and unarmed. The visual evidence transformed the scale of the revelation. The photographs prompted immediate national reaction. Anti-war demonstrations invoked My Lai as evidence of deeper problems in the conduct of the war. The focus was not yet on the fate of a single officer, but on whether the Army's leadership had failed in its oversight. Congressional offices requested briefings. Senior military leadership faced direct questioning about how the killings had been reported and whether senior officers had failed to intervene. Editorials and public statements focused on whether the massacre reflected failures within the chain of command. The central question was whether accountability would extend beyond the platoon level. Within weeks of Hersh's reporting, Army Chief of Staff General William Westmoreland appointed Lieutenant General William Peers to conduct a formal inquiry. The Peers Commission began hearings in late 1969. Its task was not to retry the massacre itself, but to determine what had happened afterward. Who knew what, who failed to act, and whether information had been suppressed. The investigation documented breakdowns at multiple levels of command. Testimony included accounts from Hugh Thompson and members of his helicopter crew, who reported what they had witnessed and also described having to intervene in order to stop any further killing. The Peers Commission formally issued its report on March 14, 1970. Peers summarized the implications bluntly. If these acts were committed, and if they represent the standard operating procedure of this unit, then the United States Army is in serious trouble. 26 officers and enlisted men were eventually charged in connection with My Lai, but only a handful of the accused would ultimately stand trial, and only one conviction would follow. As the scope of prosecution narrowed, public attention narrowed with it. Early reporting had focused on how the massacre was allowed to happen and how it had been recorded. By the time trials began, the case was increasingly framed around a small group of officers. The broader questions about command responsibility began to recede from public view. Among those implicated were Lieutenant William Calley, Captain Ernest Medina, who commanded Charlie Company, and Colonel Oran Henderson, who commanded the brigade. Enlisted soldiers, including Paul Meadlow, were also investigated. On March 29, 1971, Calley was convicted of premeditated murder for the deaths of 22 civilians and sentenced to life imprisonment. By the time the verdict was delivered, he was the only officer facing a prison sentence for the killings at My Lai. Responsibility in the courtroom had narrowed to a single defendant. For many Americans, what had begun as scrutiny of institutional responsibility now centered on the punishment of a single officer, and the reaction to that conviction was immediate and intense. Public opinion polling indicated that nearly 78% of respondents disagreed with the verdict, and roughly 79% believed the life sentence was too severe. Many argued that Calley had been following orders. In Georgia, Governor Jimmy Carter, who would later become president, declared American Fighting Man's Day, encouraging citizens to demonstrate support for U.S. troops. Other governors ordered flags flown at half-staff. Thousands of telegrams supporting clemency reached the White House. A song titled The Battle Hymn of Lieutenant Calley sold more than 1 million copies and entered the Billboard Hot 100. President Richard Nixon privately remarked to Henry Kissinger that most Americans don't give a shit whether he killed them or not, reflecting the administration's reading of public sentiment. Within days, Nixon ordered Calley transferred from prison to house arrest pending appeal. Calley ultimately served approximately 3.5 years under house arrest. Paul Meadlow testified against Calley after receiving immunity from prosecution. Captain Medina was tried and acquitted. Colonel Henderson was acquitted and later administratively reprimanded for failing to conduct a proper investigation. In 1974, a federal judge ordered Calley's release, citing procedural errors related in part to the handling of witness statements under the Jenks Act. At each stage, the circle of accountability narrowed until only one conviction remained. The institution acknowledged wrongdoing, but responsibility did not travel far up the chain of command. My Lai was not the only incident of civilian killing during the Vietnam War. Allegations surfaced during Operation Iron Mountain in 1969. In February 1970 at Son Tang, U.S. Marines killed 16 women and children in an operation that initially resulted in convictions, but which were later overturned on appeal. In the Central Highlands, investigations into Tiger Force uncovered abuse that took years to document. And in the Mekong Delta, allegations concerning the 9th Infantry Division suggested that thousands of civilians may have been killed in a single tactical zone, though the figures remain contested. But none of those cases produced the same sustained national reaction as My Lai. When the massacre first became public, attention centered on how it had been reported and whether senior officers bore responsibility. As investigations concluded and prosecutions narrowed, That debate increasingly focused on the punishment of a single lieutenant. Regardless, My Lai endured because the evidence converged. Soldiers described it, letters documented it, photographs made it visible. There were moments when the trajectory could have shifted, when reports were written, when warnings were raised, when investigations might have widened before Army discharges limited legal jurisdiction. Each time the response narrowed rather than expanded. But despite initial efforts to hide and contain the massacre, the events at My Lai live on because brave individuals, on the ground, in letters, in photographs, in print, refuse to let the official version stand alone. If you want more stories from history's most defining moments, make sure to like this video, subscribe, and turn on notifications.